Hi, so today we're going to talk about genetic algorithms. So, a genetic algorithm is, just as it sounds, it is an algorithm that is inspired by evolution. It's a concept of starting out with some characteristics that vary among your species. Like for humans, it could be characteristics like height, weight, intelligence, build, etc. And how those characteristics change over time for the society as a whole throughout the generations. Now, evolution is all about survival of the fittest. We evolve to develop characteristics that will better help us survive, and these algorithms are inspired exactly by that thought. So, for example, if you have a generation where you have two species of the same animal, one one species, anyway, is strong and quick, and the other is slow and weak. After many generations, and both of them have to hunt to survive. After many generations, only one species, namely the strong and the quick one, will survive, and the weak and the slow one will die out. Of course, other things can happen, such as mutations, and the slow and the weak one can develop, can mutate and get the ability to hibernate, which would help them survive. But mutations aside, one species would just simply die out, and that would just be by the process of natural selection. Mutation is something that's very important in genetic algorithms, and we will talk more about that later when we get to an example. But yeah, anyway, now before we get into like the characteristics and the examples, I do want to say that I know nothing about biology, and I'm simply just here to talk about algorithms that evolution and natural selection inspires. Okay, so let's talk about the main characteristics of a genetic algorithm. So the first is genes. Now, genes are just the characteristics of your individual. So if it's humans, it could be your weights, builds, intelligence, mobility, etc. If we're talking about animals, it could be the thickness of your fur, the thickness of your skin, your ability to hibernate, speed, size, etc. Whatever, a bunch of things. Um, the next is variation in these genes. So, when we start out with our first generation in a genetic algorithm, we want to start out with very high variance in the genes. So, if we were talking about humans, we would want humans that are tall, short, in the middle, everything in between that. Same with weights, heavy, light, in the middle, and everything in between that. And the same for intelligence and everything else. We want high variation because our we write a genetic algorithm for a specific goal, and if we don't have high variation in the genes, it's there might be a scenario where our generation just never reach the goal because they don't have the right characteristics to reach the goal, which is why, because everything is just happening randomly, right? This will make more sense when we come to the example if variation isn't clear yet. But having very high variation in the genes is beneficial. We'll talk a little more about that in the example. It'll definitely get clear then. The final characteristic is natural selection. And this is essentially reproduction, so it's survival of the fittest. Now, in a genetic algorithm, when we have a specific goal, we only want the individuals in our generation that are performing very well to reproduce more so that our next generation perform well and build on that, and so on and so forth. Again, this point as well will become a lot more clear when we talk about the example. So yeah, actually, let's just get right into the example after this. So this example should make genetic algorithms a lot more clear, because like learning about the idea at a very high level versus actually thinking of how to implement this programmatically is very different. So yeah, let's jump right into this. So this is a maze, and the goal is to reach the red point, and the blue dots are our civilization. That's where our generations spawn, and the goal of each dot is to find its way all the way up to the red dot. All right. So the end goal of the genetic algorithm is just to find an efficient path from the start position all the way to the red point. So this is a so in this very simple example, the attributes of our dots are just going to be just one array of vectors. The vectors will describe the magnitude and the direction of the movement. So once the dot iterates over all of the vectors in its array, it'll just die. Now, now this is why we want very high variation in the genes, because if all of these dots that are over here, if if the genetic array of vectors just tells them to go towards the right, they will keep going towards the right, die out, they will produce children, the children will have similar genetics, which means they will also go to the right, and everyone will just keep going to the right, and they will never reach the red dot. So that's why we need high variation, because we want some of them to go to the left. They will be fitter than the ones that are going to the right, because they're getting closer to the red dot. So they will reproduce, and then they will keep going to the left, and some of them will have genetics to go up, and then slowly, over the course of many generations, it'll find a way to get to the red dot. That's the idea. Alright, so that's why we want high variance in the genetics. Okay, so now as the generations die out, we want to pass that genetic information from one generation to the next generation. And we would prefer to pass on the genetics that of the fitter dots from the previous generation. So we essentially have to have a function that calculates the fitness score of each dot. And for an example as simple as this, it suffices to have a fitness function that is very simple, that just calculates the distance between the point where the dot dies and the red point. So the lower the distance, the fitter that point is. And when we come to reproduction, there are various different ways to make that happen. You could just choose your X fittest parents to reproduce. You could assign probabilities based on the fitness score. So the more fit a dot is, the more likely it is to reproduce. And generally that is the better approach, because, like as we mentioned before, we want high variance in the genetics. And if we just start killing off the bad genes, like the gene for going right could just be lost. And if we reach a point where we reach over here and then we have dots over here, but now none of those dots have genes to go towards the right, they'll essentially never reach the red point. So that's why we don't really want to just start killing them off. We just want to decrease the chance of them reproducing. But we still want to have their genetics somewhere in the civilization. So now let's come to reproduction. And in reproduction, there are two main things. One is crossover, which is like the reproduction itself, parents coming together to have babies. And the second is mutation. And let's discuss crossover first, of how you mix genetic information to have the children, and then we'll talk about mutation after that. So there are various ways you can mix up genetic information, and this is completely up to the person designing the genetic algorithm. But so in this case, since our genetics is just an array of vectors, you could select two parents and take the first half of the array from parent 1, the second half of the array from parent 2, join the arrays, and you have a child. You could alternate the elements, so the first element from parent 1, the first element from parent 2, then the second, and like just keep alternating them and create a child from that. You could take more elements from a fitter parent. You could do anything you want. Instead of two parents, you could have just one parent. You could have 5 parents. You could do whatever you want with this. And yeah, so basically that is crossover. It's completely up to how you would like to design the algorithm, and a lot of them could work very well. There's no specific way to just pick how you should do the crossover. Having two parents is generally good enough. You don't really have to add more complexity than that. I mean, we're a civilization that has evolved from having just two parents, and we're incredibly complex. So yeah, there's no point adding artificial complexity. But yeah, let's move on to mutation. Now, before the child is born, after the crossover happens, we do have mutation, and a mutation can occur every, say, X%, and the value of X is very small. It could be 1%, it could be much lower than 1%. And again, the point of mutation is variation, because again, if we have points that have reached here and none of them in their genetic makeup have the vector to go right, they will never reach that point. Never reach that point. But if they mutate, and at some point they develop the mutation to go towards the right, they'll reach their goal. That's why mutation is extremely important. Now you could choose to mutate the vectors again in any which way. Okay, so just like crossover, this is completely up to the person who is designing the algorithm. But you could decide to mutate one element of the vector. You could mutate a subarray. You could mutate the entire array. You could do whatever you want, essentially. Now, once this reproduction is complete, the simulation is just run again, the fitness scores are calculated, and this process just goes on again and again till you have something that finds an efficient way of going to the red dot. And once your civilization has achieved a goal, genetic algorithm is complete, and you've basically completed the task that you were trying to do. Now, I get that even with this simple example, it can be a little hard to wrap your head around this concept. So I'm going to put a few links in the description, and I would highly recommend you check them out. Code Bullet has some very good projects based on genetic algorithms. He plays various different games with genetic algorithms, which is really cool. And Primer has some extremely good videos, very well made, on simulating natural selection in our society. And that's something that'll, I think, make a lot of sense to everyone and just resonate with everyone. So I highly recommend checking that out. And I don't know. I just can't stress it enough. Like the immense complexity that we can derive from just a very simple sort of rules is really fascinating, and these algorithms are just extremely elegant. So please do check those videos out. They will really help you understand genetic algorithms a lot better. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you.